All right.
Good.
My guest is Paul Manafort. Paul is a consultant. He's a lobbyist. He graduated Georgetown University as a lawyer, worked as a lobbyist and as an advisor to several Republican presidents. In 2017, 2016, he volunteered his services to work for the campaign of Donald J. Trump. That's when the trouble started, Paul. So why don't we pick it up right from there?
Okay. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I want
The trouble didn't start with Trump. The trouble started with a bunch of Democrats who couldn't understand how they lost to Donald Trump. And as a result of that, we discovered that they were weaponizing our legal system, our law enforcement system, to perpetrate lies that they knew were lies. And it was a 5-year endeavor on their part. That's continuing on today with the January 6th debacle, where the same group of Democrats who refused to accept Donald Trump's victory in 2016 and did everything they could to undermine his presidency, including making impeachment as just a tactical tool of a Democratic majority in the Congress, now claiming that democracy was challenged on January 6th, as opposed to what they did for 5 years. The hypocrisy is pretty incredible, but it endures because back in 2016 with Hillary Clinton as a candidate, and now in 2022 with Joseph Biden as a president, they don't have anything to run on. And so all they can do is attack and be negative and spread lies, and it's continuing.
The attack against Trump is unprecedented in American history, maybe the worst since the attack against Abraham Lincoln in many ways. And it was more than just the Democrats. It was the Rhino Republicans. It was the media. It was what I think President Trump accurately called the deep state, what Stephen K. Bannon has called the administrative state. It was this sort of informal collusion of a lot of forces that viewed Trump as a threat to their power and their authority, which I think had been growing since, mostly the last century. And Trump posed as an existential threat to that. He posed as a figure who could wake Americans up to who we are, as Americans, as sovereign citizens under God and limited government. And, he talked about going against both the Democrats and Republicans in his inaugural address, which should be must reading for every teenager, every American, how to stand up to this bureaucracy of power, this informal government. And you, Paul, got basically the worst end of the deal in terms of, getting caught up in this as President Trump's campaign manager. So they basically made a lot of accusations against you for which are false, but even if they were, there were some misdemeanors, these are things that are being done in a major way by such figures as the Podesta brothers and Hunter Biden and many others who are working with foreign governments in a manner that can only be described as influence peddling. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump recognized that the American people were getting the short end of government. He recognized that Washington, and he considered it all Washington, not Democrat or Republican or the media, Washington didn't really care about anything other than their own perpetuation of power. And his candidacy was spawned by this desire to drain the swamp and to show the American people that government could be responsive to their needs. And in his campaign, he talked about that he was going to be a president of all the people, as opposed to the Democrats claiming to the Black Americans, to the Hispanic Americans, that they were the only ones who could protect their interests. Trump said, look, vote for me and you're going to see that government can make your lives better. Don't vote for me, and you're still going to see it because I'm still going to make your life better. Well, they didn't take him seriously in Washington. They should have, but they didn't. And when he won, they didn't understand how he won. And so all of a sudden they did what, the establishment does all the time. They doubled down on an attempt to destroy something they didn't understand and wasn't a part of it. and anything that was a part of that, what they were trying to bring down, which was Donald Trump, was a target for their narrative. I was part of the Trump entourage. They saw me as a means to get Donald Trump. Their goal was to take me down, to squeeze me, to give them Donald Trump. Well, I would have had to lie to do that, which I wasn't going to do, and because I knew there was nothing wrong, that we had done nothing wrong, and I refused to give in. What they did is they indicted me on charges that I'd been cleared of before, or settled with the government on. And in the course of that, they then didn't just indict me; they put a gag order on me so that I couldn't talk while they were leaking false stories about me to the media, to basically destroy me in the court of public opinion before I ever had my chance for a trial.
So you had the phenomena of Trump being elected and of serving, I would contend, the most successful term as president since FDR in terms of getting things done across the board. Any area we could discuss that. But they went after him in spite of the fact that they went after him with this cockamamie conspiracy theory that he was spying for Russia and that he was a tool of the Russians. And they wove this idea that he had been put in power through an election impropriety. I don't want to use the F word because I'll get kicked off YouTube. But right, I mean, and this whole weird conspiracy theory, and they backed that up with this Mueller group, this group of brown shirts who went after people like yourself and Roger Stone and others, dragging people out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning and putting them up with a CNN filming on the front lawn, and doing stuff that should never happen in this country. And yet people in this country have been so conditioned by this drip, drip, drip propaganda against Trump that there's something evil about him when they don't really know why, that they were actually applauding when they saw this happen, which horrified me as much as the fact that it was even happening. So they go after you with these false charges, trying to get you to lie about Trump in exchange for your freedom. That should never happen in this country. It's an outrage.
No, it shouldn't. And I deal with the details of that in my book. The deep state couldn't believe they lost. That's what it amounted to. And they feared the results of a Trump presidency. And as the economy started to get better and as people's lives started to improve and you started to see real wages increase for the most underprivileged in our society, they panicked. I mean, all of a sudden they knew that Trump was exposing the lie of their fake interest in making a country better. Additionally, they were worried that in draining the swamp, as Trump was talking about, if he had been reelected, that he would have been able to institutionalize a lot of what he was doing to clean out the swamp, the bureaucracy. And so they doubled up. And, we now know from John Durham's investigation that as early as July of 2016, Obama was briefed by John Brennan, the CIA director, that the Clinton campaign was going to put out a false narrative on Trump colluding with Russia. Obama knew that in July of 2016. The end of July, the FBI greenlit Crossfire Hurricane, which was an FBI investigation using sources overseas to try and prove what they knew was a false narrative. And then you could just carry it right through to the famous meeting that Obama had in December of 2016 with his national security team, where he sort of asked them to go out, create a report that would normally take 6 months to 9 months in less than 30 days, that would again show narratives that they knew were false in order and to declassify rumored emails and things like that and interactions between the agencies that were meant to create a story that didn't exist. And in the course of that, we now know from Durham that there was collusion. The real collusion was Clinton and the Democrats and the Obama administration and the Russians and the Ukrainians. We now know, again, because of Durham, that Clinton's campaign hired Perkins Coie, and then illegally, and they've been fined by the FEC now, but it doesn't do much for making things better. But Perkins Coie never reported that they were hiring Fusion GPS, which then went out and hired foreigners, including Christopher Steele and Russians, Igor Devchenko and other Russians in Moscow, to find the narrative on Trump and me. They didn't find it, so they just made it up. They made up the Steele dossier, and then they put it into the system through the FBI. Michael Sussman, with one phone call, was able to get a meeting with the general counsel of the FBI to give him the story about basically the Steele dossier. So the game was all fixed, and none of it was. It was all related to issues that they knew were false, but it didn't stop them.
Right, and the media did nothing to investigate it. They wanted to tell this story. They went with it, a major case of projection, of psychological projection, because it was them who were colluding with Russia and Ukraine, or elements within Ukraine. Their lever against you in particular, Paul, and I think what they thought they could work with, was the fact that you were a consultant to Yanukovych, the duly elected president of Ukraine. And they smeared him as being pro-Putin, and therefore tried to make you look like you were part of some kind of a Russian conspiracy. And while at the same time they were spearheading a color revolution against him, he was elected, and putting in place their own people, and the people that were involved in that are now in the Biden administration, and that they're responsible for pushing Ukraine toward joining NATO, which is a terrible mistake. I mean, it would be like Mexico, forming a military alliance with communist China and letting them put troops on the southern border. And that, of course, led to Russia responding by invading parts of Ukraine. So, talk a little bit about that aspect of this, how they use that as a lever.
Yeah, I get into this in my book in great detail, but the bottom line was when Yanukovych was elected president, he was committed to bring Ukraine into the European community, into the EU. He drew a line on NATO because, for the very reason you mentioned, and the Europeans didn't want Ukraine in NATO, and the dirty little secret is they didn't really want Ukraine into the European Union, but they couldn't object to that. And so we spent the first 3 years of Yanukovych's term as president changing the legal, economic, and regulatory structures of that country to comply with Ukraine, with the European requirements. This is all public information. There's nothing I'm telling you that wasn't known at the time. I was dealing with Jose Barroso, who was the president of the EC, and Stefan File, who was the commissioner of enlargement, on behalf of Ukraine, dealing with all of this. It was all very public, all very open. And so but the point is, Ukraine was formerly part of Russia. Yanukovych, when the coup, as you call it, which I don't disagree with, happened, fled not because of fear for his life, but because of corruption, which all of Ukraine is corrupt, unfortunately. But he shouldn't have fled. If he hadn't, I think he would probably be in a much better place today. But because he fled to Russia, they said, see, he was Russian, even though it was Putin who threatened to shut down Ukraine, again, very publicly, if Ukraine wouldn't join the customs union that Putin had, which Ukraine refused to do. And so Putin was in the process of doing that when the sort of mini revolution, happened in Ukraine. They knew all of this. There was no tie to Russia. And in fact, if you look at both the Mueller report and you look at the Senate Intel Committee report, there's not one piece of evidence, not one piece of paper that links me with anything Russian, and that's after all the hundreds of or thousands probably of hours and investigations that were going on, nothing, because it didn't exist. And they knew that, but the narrative was important. And that's why they put the gag order on me, so that I couldn't respond. And when somebody out of Ukraine who had worked with me on bringing Ukraine into the European Union from the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine wanted to write an article saying this is absurd. Paul Manafort was totally pro-West in what he was helping us to do. And they criticized me for correcting his op-ed piece that he wrote. I didn't ask him to write it. But there were some factual mistakes in it that I fixed. Weissman, using the gag order, went back to Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who, as far as I was concerned, was part of the prosecution, even though she was the judge, and got her to threaten me with first accused me of violating her gag order, which I didn't, and then threatened me with incarceration if I spoke even indirectly to the media. Meanwhile, they're flooding the media with false stories about me, and I couldn't defend myself. That's the game we were up against. And I go through this in great detail in the book. But now you see it again with what some of the same players are doing out of the Justice Department, going after parents who are trying to use their constitutional rights to oppose school boards that are teaching their kids things that the parents don't agree with, going after conservative organizations. I mean, it hasn't stopped, and it's just less visible right now, and that's why it's important. But I do believe the silver lining in the cloud is the American people finally get it. Number one, they see who is president matters. They see the difference between Trump's policies and Biden's exact opposite policies, and they've made a judgment on that. They also see the difference between the freedoms that were challenged by us or by them against the Trump during his years, and the freedoms that parents are being challenged with right now, as an example, or law and order issues in the cities or whatever. So they're seeing it, and that's why you see what looks like a growing, large victory for Republicans in November, because they are not accepting this fascist regime and the tactics they're taking.
Right, and indeed, I think that the only thing that could prevent a historic landslide in November is the thing that we can't mention because I'm on YouTube, but everyone knows what I'm talking about. All right, my guest is Paul Manafort, political prisoner, persecuted, but not silenced. A lot of the heavy-handed government fascistic tactics, I think, go back, frankly, to Obama and his use of the IRS to go after conservatives. A scandal that came up with the Lois Lerner, pleading the fifth 50 times in front of Congress, and continues now. So basically, I'm outraged that they would tell you or any American citizen that they're not allowed to speak to the media, and that while they attack you, you're not allowed to defend yourself. I mean, that to me alone is an outrage.
Well, that's not the only did. When I was arraigned is when the gag order was put on me. At the same time, they also imposed a $10 million bond on me. John Gotti didn't have to post a $10 million bond. And I was being required to do that for violating allegedly a Foreign Registration Act, where I failed to disclose something, according to them, that I should have disclosed. And it's something that had never been charged criminally in the history of the act going back to the 1930s. It's something that I'd already been cleared on by the same office inside the Department of Justice. But so they put the $10 million bond on me because they knew I didn't have the $10 million. And they threw a gag order on me so that I couldn't complain about it. And with the risk of being incarcerated, when I finally did get the bond issue resolved, it took me about 6 months. When I finally got it resolved and they knew it was getting resolved, is when they threw the phony witness tampering charging on me, and which is the basis upon which they then the judge sent me directly to jail from the courtroom into solitary confinement for a year.
And at any time you could have stopped it if you were willing to play ball and lie about what you knew. I've interviewed Dr. Jerome Corsi, who went through the same thing when he was brought in to testify. Your colleague, Roger Stone, had the same thing. It's this pressure to tell them what they want to know and just make it up in exchange for your freedom. So they put you in prison. You've never been charged with a crime your entire life. The FARA charge is at best, even if it were true, a misdemeanor, one that has never been brought against anyone before, and certainly could have been brought against perhaps the Podesta brothers and Hunter Biden, who were definitely engaging in foreign involvements that were not reported. And then you're sent to solitary confinement. Paul, if you don't mind, could I ask you about how that went down? I mean, what was that like?
It was no fun.
Yeah,
I was in an 8 by 10 cell, no windows. The door had a little slot in it that closed, and the food would be shipped, put through 3 times a day, and it was 24/7 lockdown. And I had a shower and a toilet in my room, metal shower and toilet. I slept on a slab, really a concrete slab that had a mattress on it, about a 1 inch thick mattress. And I realized early on that what was going to be important was that I find a way to cope with this, and not just sitting there. And so between my family and my faith, and my conviction that I was innocent and I wasn't going to let them get to me, I built a regime that I followed every day, and it became my life for a year. And it got me through that time.
well,
There was no
thank God.
basis. There was no basis for me being in solitary confinement. They said it was for my protection, but it really wasn't. It was to break me.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's torture. And do you have any reflections on the prison system and what could be done to improve it? Because I know that President Trump took major initiatives, particularly the First Step Act, which released 10,000 prisoners, mostly African American men, who had been involved with misdemeanors.
Yeah, I write about this in my book. I mean, there are a couple of things that are relevant to it. Number one is there are a lot of people who are in prison, young Black for the most part, who are there because the system screwed them. I mean, they may have done something wrong, but the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, the state prosecutors would work together to mislead them, get them to plea, and then have the feds information given to the states, and the states would get around the federal government plea agreements and come after them for the same charges. And where there wasn't double jeopardy in most states, these kids got doubled what they thought they were going to be getting. And then when they got put in jail, there's nothing in the system to help them, build, to prepare to get out of for a new life. The paper, if you look at the books, the laws and the regs, there's a lot of programs, but the reality is in the prisons, none of that is real. None of it is true. And part of what time I spent in the year that I was in Loretto after I was sentenced, I would be working with these kids to help them on parenting kind of issues, on how to do business properly, how to assimilate back into society, because they had no direction. And some of them were in for 10, 15 years, which is why in the end, if Donald Trump was a hero in the prisons, because he did what he said he was going to do. The First Step Act, said that nonviolent criminals should not be sentenced to extremely long periods of time, and they should be out and given a chance to get back into society. The prisoners appreciated that, and it's again was a disconnect between the rhetoric of the Democrats and the policies of the Trump administration, and it's shown through very clearly.
And that's why Trump is such a threat to them. They can speak in lofty tones with their phony British accents about helping minorities, but yet Trump is there as a hero to minorities. And I think that he got a very large vote from African Americans and Hispanics, probably a lot larger than people realize. But we can't talk about that because this is YouTube. That's the election of 2020. But here we are facing the midterms. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to run again and for a third term? And do you think he'll win?
Well, I think Biden is making it easier for Trump every day, meaning that, as I said a few minutes ago, you look at Trump's policies, his economic policies, his energy independence policies, his America First foreign policy, his border security programs, and then you look at the mess the country's in today, and people now understand who is president matters. And that's what this whole January 6th thing is all about. The Democrats fear Trump is going to run again.
Right.
They're trying to do anything they can to make Trump either unacceptable to the population or not able to run. They're not going to succeed. And if anything, they still haven't figured Donald Trump out. If you want to get Donald Trump to not do something, the last thing in the world you do is treat him the way they're treating him right now. And,
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole phony thing is imploding on itself, and they get this young woman up there perjuring herself, it appears, and now, I mean, it does look like it's just an attempt to muddy up Trump and damage the MAGA movement, which was 75 million Americans voting for him. And as a good thing, the Supreme Court apparently is about to decide a case that's going to reestablish and protect the sacred right of one man, one woman, one vote. And that's going to be good news for Republicans generally and for anybody who's freedom oriented as a candidate. Now, Paul, have you, I would surmise that your book and what you're saying now runs against the same narrative controlled by the liberals and the New York Times that was in place for the 4 years of the Trump administration. So I am absolutely honored that you're coming on my small program, but I'm hoping that you're getting some traction amongst the bigger mainstream media. Are people responding?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in my story. The book comes out August 16th. You can get it in advance pre-order on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles right now. It's not out until August 16th. And so a lot of the major media I'll be doing will be around the time of the book hitting the public bookstores. But there's a lot of interest. I mean, I'm going to be very busy in August and September.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to know that. And I'm just, I prayed for you while you were in prison, and I think a lot of people did in this country.
You know what? You're
horrendous atrocity.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And let me tell you, I mean, it sounds like a cliche when you say, I felt the power of prayer, but I felt the power of prayer. Indeed. Sitting in solitary confinement, I would have these rushes for no reason that would make me feel good about my situation, and not positive about my situation. And that was prayer. There's no doubt in my mind.
Well, it's a powerful and important story. I'm glad to have given you a platform to discuss it. Let our view, well, your book isn't out until August 16th. It's Political Prisoner, Persecuted, Prosecuted, but Not Silenced by Any Means. Paul Manafort, it's been an honor and a pleasure. I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed our time together.